considered to be one of the two most prominent sociologists of consumption in the US and hence in the world, today as our dear speaker. I won't talk about her rewards and honors because it's going to take up too much time. So I'll rather address another aspect of her career that sort of befits her presence in a DS context quite well. Because Juliet is a truly cross-disciplinary scholar. She first spent 17 years as an economist at Harvard University before shifting field and institution. So in the new millennium, she became a professor of sociology at Boston College. Among her many claims to fame are her widely selling books, The Overworked American and The Overspent American, which made her thesis about the relationships between labor market and consumer society known both within academic environments, but also among many interested readers, intellectuals, and policymakers. And since then, she's also introduced the notion of plenitude in a variety of books, also together with our good friend, mutual friend, Craig Thompson, as an approach to a more sustainable society of production and consumption. But today she will share her reflections on yet another addition to contemporary market systems, the strange phenomenon of the sharing economy. So Juliet, personally and on behalf of DS and University of Southern Denmark, a very heartfelt welcome among us. The screen is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Soren. It's a pleasure to be here, and I was looking forward to coming in person. So anyway, we'll try and do that at another time. So let me just share my screen, and I'm going to show slides, and then I'll take them off when we get to the conversation portion. And am I correct that we have 1 hour total? Is that right, or what is the total? Just so I don't talk for too long.
Yes, one hour total. Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. So the title of my talk today is The Sharing Economy, Techno-Dystopia or Cyber Liberation. And this comes from this book that I've just published last month called After the Gig, How the Sharing Economy Got Hijacked and How to Win It Back. And that's the publisher's subtitle. Okay, so the so-called gig or sharing economy launched in during the Great Recession of 2008, 9, 10. Big platforms were founded in 2008 and 9, and it launched with what I've called the idealist discourse, which had economic, social, and environmental claims. It emerged from Silicon Valley, which also had an idealist discourse, often called cyber utopianism or the Californian ideology by some. And this is the idea that the technology, in this case, digital technology, would create all these wonderful things, an egalitarian outcome, better relations among people, etc. So with the gig economy or the sharing economy, and by this I'm talking about platforms like Airbnb, and this is an ad from that early time that Airbnb put in the New York City subway as the city was trying to get rid of illegal rentals. Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, TaskRabbit, which is an errand site in Europe, of course, Deliveroo, and so forth. These platforms promised a new way to work without a boss and with freedom for workers, freedom to set their own schedules and work as they wanted, income for a struggling middle class, entrepreneurial activities. They also claimed they would be more inclusive racially, and these are the economic claims. There's some others, but those are the main ones. They claimed that they would build social capital through person-to-person exchanges and that they would reduce carbon and eco footprints. Airbnb said that we won't have to build new hotels because people will stay in each other's homes. The what were called at that time ride sharing, Uber and Lyft, which are our two main ride hailing platforms, claimed that people would give up their cars and we could all, share rides together. So uh, this is another ad that I found in the New York subway. The shared economy is a lie. New Yorkers don't agree. And in fact, the day these ads went up in New York, um, these kinds of graffiti were, by the end of the day, were all over the city. People really contesting the idea that Airbnb is great for New York City. And so we can ask whether this idealist discourse was a failed agenda. The environmental impacts have been mostly very negative, and that's something that we could have seen, many of us did, from the very beginning. The two biggest platforms in the sharing economy, Uber and Airbnb, were making transportation and travel much, much cheaper. So the idea that this could somehow reduce carbon footprints was absolutely implausible from the get-go. And although we have very little independent research on Airbnb, the little we do have suggests it has increased travel as expected by making it much cheaper. And we have a lot more on ride hail, which shows it has increased vehicle miles, number of cars, congestion, and so forth. And even the ride hail companies have put out studies showing that, yes, they are responsible for more driving and more CO2 in the atmosphere. In terms of social connections, the evidence is, I say spotty here, rather mixed. There are a few platforms that researchers have found have facilitated social connection. BlaBlaCar is one of them, long distance ride sharing in Europe. But what's interesting is how the early days in which social connections certainly seem to be happening have led to more what we might call normalization or conventionalization of human interactions on these platforms. And although there's some, certainly an Airbnb with present hosts, where hosts stay in the home, is the best example of widespread social interaction. You also have a shift on that platform to more and more commercialized hosting with absent hosts, so no actual contact between hosts and guests. Now, what I'm going to focus on today, although I'd be willing, happy to talk in the question and answer about the environmental and social issues, I'm going to talk about the labor side of things and what's happening to gig workers. And what we've seen in recent years is what started out as pretty good conditions for many workers and fairly satisfied conditions for many workers, that those conditions have been deteriorating, growing worker unrest and dissatisfaction. And since the pandemic started, in fact, a series of labor actions, strikes, and so forth. And so this is what I've called this the hijacking of the sharing economy. And the top one is the first global strike of ride-hail drivers on last May 8th. And then Instacart, which is a shopping app, grocery shopping, which has had numerous issues with worker dissatisfaction, a boycott, strikes, etc. So how did we go from the, quote, idealist discourse and the win-win-win narrative of the early days to Uber drivers sleeping in cars, Instacart horrors, and widespread worker unrest? And why do workers who greatly desire flexibility and independent contractor, that IC status, now support employee status? And this is the regulatory side of what's happening now. Almost all of these platforms hire people as what are called in our legal system in the US independent contractors rather than employees, which means that they have no protections, no minimum wages, no unemployment insurance, no workers' compensation, no protections at all, unlike employees who have a set of labor protections. So just a word about the research that I did. This is my original team. These are all PhD students in sociology. All but one of them are at Boston College, where I am. One is a former BC undergraduate who was at nearby Boston University. And that project went through 2018. We're actually still writing papers, but officially the project ended. And then in 2019, I began a new project with colleagues at nearby University, Northeastern, funded by the National Science Foundation, called the Algorithmic Workplace. And this one is a collaboration with engineers, sociologists and engineers, and we are looking more closely at the algorithms, at issues of risk. We're studying 10 platforms, doing interview data, agent-based modeling, and we also have a company who, one of the engineers wrote the algorithm for the company, so we have access to a lot more people for interviews and data from that company, and it's a delivery, logistics and delivery company. Okay, so what did we study? The first round of, we started with a case study methodology, and the first round of cases was actually nonprofits, not the for-profit companies that I've just been talking about. And we started with nonprofits in the early days, even before it was called the sharing economy. The group of entities that made it up, there was a community of people who were sharing a common discourse, a common orientation, and thought of themselves as doing something similarly, was made up of nonprofits and for-profits. And in Europe, I think that mix of nonprofits and for-profits is actually still more vibrant than it is in the United States. Groups like WeShare, which comes out of France, have that wide range. And so we were interested in some of the what we might call community sharing initiatives that emerged or expanded during the recession. And we studied a time bank, which is a multilateral barter economy. We studied a food swap. We studied a makerspace, which is a community production environment. And we also studied people who were using free and open resources, sharing resources on the web for people to become what we called open learners, but people who were using digital technologies to teach themselves things. And then as the for-profits began to scale, we shifted to study them, and we studied Airbnb, TaskRabbit, which is an errand site, eventually purchased by IKEA, Turo, which is sort of Airbnb for cars, a peer-to-peer car rental, Postmates, which is delivery, and Favor, that's also delivery, so Uber Eats, Foodera, Deliveroo, Uber and Lyft, and we studied a platform cooperative that is a platform that's owned by the workers and governed by the workers, called Stocksy United, which was a stock photography. And then with my new project, we are studying shoppers, so Amazon shoppers, Instacart shoppers, Deliv, which is that company I mentioned to you, and we're moving on to ride hail, caring labor, and food delivery. So a wide range of platforms, which I think turns out to be very important in what I learned, or what we learned. Okay, so we've studied a lot of different things. I'm only going to talk about one or two of them today, but just so you know, with those nonprofits, one of the key things we were interested in was their viability as new economies, emergent alternative economies. We studied status dynamics in the nonprofits, which turned out to be important to why they weren't so viable in many cases. We studied the moral aspirations of participants across all of these platforms, or many of them. We've done a lot on Airbnb, and we have a big data set on Airbnb, culture of Airbnb hosting. We've studied racial discrimination and gentrification on Airbnb. We've studied race and ratings in the reputation systems that are used by most of these platforms. We're studying now the efficacy of regulation. We've developed a national a database of Airbnb regulations. We're also trying to get funded for a greenhouse gas emissions and Airbnb project. We've looked at platform labor and income inequality, vulnerability among ride-hail drivers, labor control on delivery apps, and as I mentioned, that delivery platform cooperative. So what I want to talk about today is, first of all, to move beyond what in the United States devolved into a fairly non-analytic pro-con debate. Plenty of critics of the platforms as well as supporters of the platforms. And so I want to try and understand it a little more analytically rather than just platforms are good, platforms are bad. And so asking the question sort of how can we understand these platforms? And let me start to answer that question by looking at briefly at the four major sort of strands within the literature for understanding platforms. And the first one, and in some ways the earliest, comes from economists and to a certain extent management scholars, although they're a little bit more mixed. But basically, we can think of this as an approach which emphasizes the efficiencies of the new technologies that are used here and the ways in which those efficiencies enable entrepreneurialism. And so economists focus on the algorithms, and if we think about these technologies, what are they really? They're a set of matching algorithms and crowdsourced information, as well as digital payment systems. But the algorithms mixed with the crowdsourced information are really, I would argue, the core of what's different about these. So they reduce in economist speak, it would be reduce transactions costs, but that's kind of just a vague bucket. So they reduce the cost of management because they automate a tremendous amount of it. They outsource their HR departments to consumers to a large extent. They provide quality control. They have automated systems for people applying and even for interactions with the workers. You get enhanced efficiency in logistics, and in some cases this is really important in ride hail and delivery, for example. Big efficiencies in setting routes, reducing what economists call wild goose chases in ride hail, people driving around looking for rides, lower search costs for consumers. These foster entrepreneurialism by making it possible for people to tap into all of this technology and to have this different work experience that I mentioned, solving information deficits to reduce the risks of peer-to-peer exchange, and efficient payment systems. So there's a lot of technology here that should provide a lot of savings. And this, we can think about these, and I think there's a lot to the economists' view, but what they miss is that actually there's power here, because economists see the platform as just a these are two-sided markets. The platform is in between the buyer and the seller, and it is just increasing efficiency, and that's all that's happening, and that's clearly not what's going on. The second view kind of goes all the way to the other side. It also focuses on technology, but has a very critical point of view. And these terms come from a paper that I wrote with Steve Vallis called "What Do Platforms Do?" and we called it the algorithmic manager. So the algorithmic manager view says algorithms control all aspects of the labor process. It doesn't really focus on the efficiencies from this, more just on the power, and argues that these algorithms give asymmetric information, there's asymmetric information between the platform and the worker. The platforms have a lot of information, the workers don't, and that yields systemic power over the workers. They criticize the lack of human contact and arbitrary decisions, and they see the platform as creating an informational panopticon in which it's just sucking up data from the workers and using that data to control workers and also consumers, by the way, for individualized pricing and so forth. So it's a very dark and critical view of what's going on these platforms. The third view is very much rooted in sociology, and we can call it accelerated precarity, but it focuses on the fact that these workers are hired as independent contractors, and it's a massive risk shift to them away from the firm. And this really focuses on the idea that the workers are so precarious, and the legal issues around employee status, the lack of employee status, and what's called misclassification. The argument, these are really workers, employees, they're wrongly classified as independent contractors. What's interesting or sort of different about this view is the technology plays really no role at all here. This is a trend that's been ongoing since the 1980s, outsourcing, the fissured workplace, and so Nikification, it's been called. So here it's just, this is the acceleration of this shift. Guy Standing called it the precariat. So a shift towards out of the stable employment regime of the post-World War II period into this sort of neoliberal, precarious labor regime. And it's also been called neoliberalism on steroids. So if you think about these last two, let's, we could say the algorithmic manager fails to think about the precarity side of things. The precarity view fails to think about the technological side of things, and they both fail to think about the economics. And then there's, oh, I thought I had one more. Okay, so there is one more. Somehow that slide dropped out, and that's the idea of institutional chameleons, that these platforms, you can't really think about them in one way or the other because they're so different in different places. And it's really the political and institutional configurations of the countries where they are located that determines what they're like and what they do. And this comes from the most prominent work here is from a political scientist named Kathleen Thalen, who looked at Uber in 3 countries, Sweden, Germany, and the US. And it operates so differently there. In Sweden, it just kind of fell into the Swedish labor regime. In Germany, it ended up getting virtually banned. And in the US, it operates with impunity. And so that view basically also says the technology doesn't really play a role. There's no general trend, and it's all just contingent on the institutional and political context. So, and that one I think fails to understand that there are things about platforms that are fairly common across contexts, and I think it overstates difference, although certainly each one of these perspectives, of course, has a lot to offer. So I would argue that we need to understand platforms as a new kind of labor regime, but it's a hybrid of it's a different combination of things than we've seen in the past. So I want to focus on sort of kind of the essence. I think there are really two key things here. If we think about the conventional labor regime, since throughout the 20th century, what you see is that the employer controls hours and the labor process. The whole point of bringing workers together into factories was about controlling them, including through technology and labor policy. So in this sense, the algorithmic and the precarious points of view, can be incorporated. Um, but that's the conventional model. It's a control model, and there's a lot of top-down control. And I think people are really familiar with this. And this comes out of workplace labor process theory, from economics, sociology, etc. But let's think about the platform model. One of the things that's really key is that the employer cedes control over hours of work and some aspects of the labor process. So if you work on an app, you choose when you work, and you choose to a large extent how you work. And the platform also greatly reduces barriers to entry. These apps are open to almost anyone. There's some restrictions for criminal record, but other than that, they're pretty open. So there's a lot that there's a lot that the platform has given up in terms of control. Some of this has legally with the independent contractor designation. There are things that the platforms can't do by law. But even more than that, it's the model itself is one in which it's not, the control is not happening through direct control. The platform isn't setting schedules to the large extent. It's not setting minimum, maximum hours of work. It's not. It's pretty much taking all comers and so forth. So one of the things this means is that there's much more diversity in the labor force than in the conventional firm, because it's pretty much taking anyone. And that turns out to be really, I think, important in understanding the experience of workers on these platforms, and sort of how this model works. So, as I said, I think of this as a hybrid labor regime, a kind of unique regime that the slide I just showed, we could I have described in the book, I described it as a kind of retreat from control. So not controlling hours of work, not controlling schedules. Platforms are kind of open access, which leads to this highly heterogeneous labor force I just mentioned. Firms cede this control over hours and also over how the work is done. Not completely, and it does vary across platforms. So how do they control workers? How are they able to make profits? Of course, not all of them are making profits. People are probably aware that Uber is, I think, the most money-losing company in all of human history. But the answer to this is that they use market discipline and technology. And that's why, in thinking back to those other approaches, you really need an approach that combines the understanding of the technology with the social relations of production. And what we have argued, what we have found and what we have argued, is that something we call platform dependence is highly determinant of outcomes, number one. And number two, homovariance, meaning various kinds of economic actors, that we find multiple earner strategies and orientations on the platform. And I'm going to say a little bit more about these things now. So I think the key point here is the importance of a multi-platform study, and beyond what I would term Uber centricity in the literature. The literature on Uber is so large compared to other platforms that Uber has been seen as the model for everyone, and that, I think, that's led to some, sometimes not seeing some things. So we have done interviews with people on all those platforms I told you about, those 7 platforms, um, and over 101 earners on those 7 platforms. And now with the new project, we have about 70 interviews with shoppers and delivery workers. And I'm just for time's sake, I'm gonna go quickly through this, but basically we had to do a range of sampling. Um, there's, it's very hard to get a representative sample on these platforms because we don't really know what the true underlying sample is. Okay, so the key finding that I want to focus on now is what we call platform dependence, and it has to do with how dependent the worker is on the platform to pay their basic expenses, their monthly expenses, their rent and food and so forth. And we found 3 groups: dependents, partially dependent, and supplemental earners. People whose platform earnings are not part of their regular income source are considered extra or supplemental. Many have full-time activity, employment, or other activity like schoolings. So what we find is that this differentiator is really key in understanding platform experiences for workers. And it teaches us something about that, how this labor regime is organized. So this is our sample. Um, we have different numbers of workers in these different platforms. So the sample is not representative in terms of these categories of the entire gig labor force. We have very few drivers. Drivers tend to be much more dependent. We have a lot of Airbnbs. They're more supplemental or partially dependent. But in general, not including Airbnb, on a lot of these platforms, what most of the surveys that have looked at this find is there's been about 30%, somewhere in the range of 30% dependent workers. So we're not too far off from that. Ride hail tends to have a much higher fraction. And the other thing is important is that over time, the fraction of dependent workers in the United States has been rising. So that's another dimension of this. Anyway, so about 40% supplemental, 30 partially dependent, and 25 dependent. So I'm just going to go through maybe 2 platforms to say something about the findings, and then I'll wrap up. And I'm going to use TaskRabbit as my first case. So on TaskRabbit, if you're a supplemental earner, you can earn very good wages, and you have high non-pecuniary benefits. Many of our people told us how they really liked it because it allowed them to alleviate boredom. They weren't just sitting around playing video games. These are young people, and they have a kind of productivist mentality. They're able to be selective about jobs and therefore get high wages. They could avoid anything unsafe or problematic. They've had all that flexibility and autonomy. They use their earnings as a safety net, so it actually decreased their precarity. They use this as an alternative to low-end exploitative work like catering or other things where you have a boss and a lot of control. And some of them manage a portfolio of earnings from other platforms or other kinds of jobs. By contrast, our dependent earners, although they earned high hourly wages, were never able to find enough work to get a good annual income. So their incomes were all hovered in the poverty level. They lacked flexibility and autonomy because they had to just take whatever jobs they could get because there aren't enough jobs. And that yielded more wage jeopardy and more risky tasks. And we also found over time on this platform, things were getting worse for the workers, which is a common experience across these platforms. What about delivery workers? This is one, of course, there's been a lot more study of delivery in Europe where it's been very big. Our supplemental earners found it reasonable extra money. They really liked non-pecuniary benefits, in particular cycling, because many of them are cyclists. They were able to avoid unsafe conditions, and they didn't really care too much about their ratings. I'll tell you, what we find is that these supplemental earners don't necessarily follow platform rules. They do things the way they want. One of our informants was an African-American woman. She and her husband were doing a lot of different platforms. She had a new baby. She would deliver for Postmates, which, by the way, was just purchased by Uber. And she would do it at night. The baby would be sleeping. She would make the customers come down to her car to get the food. She refused to leave her car to get the food. I mean, this is a huge violation of company policy. But she was a supplemental earner, which meant that she was willing to take the risks of doing things the way she wanted. And this was a more general finding that we have, which is that these supplemental earners have that autonomy to kind of do the labor in the way that they want and not necessarily be subjected to that algorithmic manager that some of the critics have focused on. On the other hand, the dependent earners for these the delivery platforms are kind of job of last resort, demand erratic, the need to maintain ratings, vulnerability to weather and traffic, and there's a wage autonomy trade-off. They could get a fixed wage on one of the platforms, but then they lost their ability to choose jobs, and the wage was $15 an hour. The anecdote from this one was an African-American man with a criminal record, which made it hard for him to get jobs. He was able to get onto this platform. He would take the bus up to Boston and sleep on his brother's floor and use a scooter for this work. And one day he was in an accident, someone hit him and he needed medical attention, but he was so worried about his rating that he finished the job and then got medical attention. And we saw and he told, we learned about this in the interview, and we saw on the company Facebook page that they were praising him. They gave him a $100 gift certificate praising him because he didn't go to the hospital when he was in this accident. So that's the kind of control that the companies have over the dependent earners. All right, I'm going to skip through Uber and Lyft. They're much better known, but basic same story. The supplementals like it a lot. Reduce costs associated with full-time work, supplements their earnings, finances leisure spending. The dependent earners are basically in Uber and Lyft hell now, as the companies have reduced the earnings, squeezing the drivers. They're sleeping in their cars. It's a nightmare. Last point before I finish up, what we found, and here we looked at three, at Airbnb and TaskRabbit, but also the Stocksy, the photography platform, is that we found three different earner orientations on these platforms. One is Homo economicus, standard rational maximizer from economic theory. The second is what we call Homo instrumentalis, people who just want to earn money. They just have an instrumental attitude to it. They're not maximizing, they're not calculating, they're not looking at their expenses. It's a kind of dumb strategy. I mean, I don't say that in a pejorative way, but they just follow a heuristic. They don't figure out how to price. They don't figure out when is the best time to try and earn and so forth. And then that third group, which HS, Homo socialis, which are people for whom social aspects on the platform are very important, and they're not just out to maximize their income. Of course, everybody earning on these platforms is trying to earn income, but this is anyone from an Airbnb host who's doing it partly because they want to socialize, so social in that sense, and we found a lot of those, but also social in the sense, in a more Zelazarian sense, people who want to set boundaries, who have ethical considerations, people who will not, who are very attuned to status insults. So people who won't do certain jobs because they feel that offends their sense of who they are. One very memorable TaskRabbit who won't take jobs that involve getting somebody a latte, an easy job for some quick, easy money. But no, that's lazy. People should do that for themselves. So uh, people who draw boundaries, who have ethical limitations on what they will do, as well as people looking for social interaction. And the point about this is just, it's another piece of evidence for the idea that the companies really allow much more freedom, and have retreated from controlling the behavior. Of course, in ride hail and delivery, you do have some of that gamification where they are trying to get people to do more. But basically, this idea of more autonomy in how you earn on these platforms, and a lot of this autonomy has remained even over the whole decade now that we're talking about. Okay, so let me just end with just by summing up. A key finding is a new type of labor regime with high heterogeneity across numerous dimensions, both dependence on the platform orientations. Technology is really important, but political economy factors are also central. The discipline of the market, because the whole point about the dependency, which I didn't really stress enough, I think, is that the market is disciplining these people. The companies, need to do less because they need that income. I would say that platforms can be highly desirable and a positive economic form for workers because they do offer high levels of autonomy, but they don't work for heavily dependent workers. And in this sense, the platforms are free riding on conventional employers because it's the security of those conventional jobs that makes them work for the supplementals. And the two big areas in which people are active today in trying to solve some of the problems of platform work are regulation, which has really accelerated in the last couple of years, and these platform cooperatives. All right, so let me stop so we have a bit of time to discuss.
Thank you so much, Juliet, for your inspiring talk. And I don't know, where is Maria? There she is. Any questions, Juliet?
Yes, Sam, if you will take care of any questions there might be.
Yeah, I'm trying to see if there are any raised hands among the participants. Dorman, you have a question?
Yes, thanks for a very nice presentation. It's really impressive, the amount of work and all the consideration that went into these projects. I was wondering, looking at your findings, if the idealist discourse that you started off with, is it still present in some way? Does it still have any force whatsoever among these workers? Does it have some kind of moral imperative on how they see their work and themselves, or is it gone altogether?
I think to a large extent in the US it's gone, because what happened is the behaviors of the nonprofit. So the nonprofits were important for, providing that veneer of idealism. And I think that for two reasons, they've really diverged. I mean, the behavior of the for-profit platforms is really key here because they became very predatory and commercialized and so forth. And Uber and Lyft are just such bad actors that it's really hard to maintain any kind of idealism with respect to that. I mean, they're trying with their fight against reclassification of their employees, but Airbnb still tries to keep a little bit more of a veneer, and it is more plausible in their case. With Airbnb, the issue is really the insiders are happy, the outsiders are not. So the impacts are really on the city, rents, availability of housing, congestion, turning neighborhoods into tourist traps and so forth, tourist areas. Um, so I would say for the most part, the answer is no. I think in Europe, there is more plausibility to it, and it is still uh, there is still more of a sense of a community of both profits and nonprofits, and I think that's for two reasons. One is that the for-profits have been more regulated in Europe, although there are plenty of bad outcomes, like Barcelona and Airbnb and so forth. But so they've done less harm in some ways, but more importantly, the nonprofits and the sort of mixed kind of hybrid actors, I haven't talked about those, but there are for-profit actors who are very they have more of a social mission. So for example, we've just started studying a food donation platform called Olio, which is a for-profit, but it's a free platform, no money. It's just free food donation. That community, represented probably most prominently by WeShare, is stronger in Europe. It has still maintained a presence, and the nonprofits in Europe have just fared much, much better than they have in the United States. They're pretty much not a factor in the US, but I think they are in Europe. So that's kind of, I do think the idealist discourse still has resonance in Europe, and I think that there's also more of a reality there. Is that do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I don't, my knowledge of the different platforms is not as extensive as yours, but it makes a lot of sense. And I do see the big differences between, for example, Airbnb and Uber. And I think that it's very contextual. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I have Keith, you have a question?
Yeah, so I've been reading Case and Deaton's Depths of Despair, so I have a lot of ideas in my head right now, kind of related to that and a little bit to this. But I was wondering, I had a question about the nature of these firms. To what extent are these like sharing platforms really just redistributing rents and acting as middlemen, and they're just exploiting the fact that they can circumvent a lot of regulations that were built up over decades that other providers of these services, had to abide by, but now they're able to circumvent them and then redistribute more rents to themselves, versus creating a new service or product?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it really varies. Ride hail, of course, you had the big fat taxi, what is the sitting duck of the taxi industry there. And actually the right-wing forces, the Koch brothers, were already mounting a huge attack on taxis and taxi regulation. So this is one of the reasons I don't like Uber centricity in the literature, because the taxi industry is a very special industry because of that regulation and those really big rents. So they're for sure knocking off rents. And Airbnb also, to a certain extent, rents, because these are fixed supply situations. On the other gig labor platforms, I think it's not a rent situation, because it is a lot of market making or market creation, certainly big market expansion. So on the regulatory side, definitely with Airbnb and Uber, that's an important part of it. But I think that, the people who say that's all it is. So there are some, lefty economists who think, oh, it's only their ability to circumvent regulation. That is, I think, is wrong, because they've expanded these markets dramatically. And that has to do with solving these problems of peer-to-peer rental, peer-to-peer exchange, what I call stranger sharing, because stranger sharing has a lot of risks associated with it. Clearly, brands solve, brand names and brand credibility, and so brand value you know, a big part of what that is solving those risks for people. So the idea that I know if I go to a Marriott hotel, I can expect a certain quality of service and so forth. Whereas if I'm renting from some random individual, that's a very risky proposition. So they had a way of, I shouldn't even say solve the risks, because I think in some sense it's not so much that they solved them. The ratings and reputation systems aren't that good yet. They're okay. But in the early days, because of the idealist discourse and who they attracted to the platforms, the rates of malfeasance weren't that high. So they were able to expand without too many problems. Of course, over time, they got more bad actors in, but on both sides, by the way, on something like Airbnb. But so I think that I think you also have to credit the technology, because the technology created new possibilities of exchange, or sort of it changed the conditions under which individuals could exchange for themselves, and made it possible for these firms to retreat from control in a way that a Marriott couldn't, or a, you know, because, or a taxi and limousine commission was having a lot of power and control over the drivers, you know, to get that quality. So I think it certainly, the regulatory aspect was important, but it's not the whole story. One other thing, you know, with just to talk about the ride hail for a second, the taxis, I think the really big issue here in the United States anyway, I don't think this is as true in Europe, where they've been more regulated. They expanded to a market size which I don't think is economically viable. In order to do it, they've had to price these rides well below cost. So you know, people believe about a 40% subsidy that the venture capitalists are giving to the riders. That's really huge. So their strategy is to dominate the market, get rid of all the competition, and then of course raise the prices to get profitability. So it's a grow and then profit strategy. I mean, that's common in Silicon Valley, but that market will shrink when the prices go up, even if they destroy all the competitors, i.e. public transportation. People will still have the option for their own cars to walk and to not go. I mean, people are taking many more rides than they would in the absence of those cheap rides. So, and hopefully they won't be able to destroy public transportation fully, but that's the Uber strategy, and I don't think it actually is a good one. I think it's just they're only going to be profitable in a smaller market.
Anna, you had a question? And Eric, yes?
Is it me, Nara?
Yes, Anna?
Yeah, thank you, Søren, and thank you, Juliet, for the wonderful presentation. I do have a question regarding methodological issues or concerns or challenges, or maybe everything went well with you. I do perform part of my research in cooperation with engineers and data scientists. Can you share your experience? How do you tackle and how do you deal with all these methodological challenges when you have interdisciplinary research, or you perform interdisciplinary research, or where you have a lot of data which you have to handle from very different methodological and of course theoretical perspectives? Have you experienced any tensions, or maybe you had some great successes which you can a bit share with us?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So this collaboration is just a year into it. We haven't written any papers yet. I would say that I think for me, it's been great, actually. You know, it's also because I'm an economist and a sociologist, so that sort of economist mindset is a little bit closer to the engineers, I think, in some ways. So it just makes it easy for me, because I often just am thinking the same way they're thinking, and one of our engineers sort of also thinks like an economist to a certain extent. So I've really enjoyed it. I think we've all enjoyed it. I think we've all learned a lot. We haven't gotten, the rubber hasn't hit the, we would say the rubber hasn't hit the road yet, meaning like, because we're not writing, we haven't written a paper yet. But what I would say is the probably the most challenging thing has to do with this company that we have all this data from. And the kinds of, so the engineers are, doing some analysis of the data. It's big data, and they're doing stuff that I think we sociologists would never, it would never occur to us to do that. And we sort of look at it and think, what are you going to get out of that? There's just, we don't see any ways forward to what in our field would be interesting findings. It feels too, what is the word? Too much just about, okay, this is the way the routes went and the packages move like this. And we sort of think, well, what can we do with that? So we're a little bit at that stage. I think we're all sort of wondering, like, we have all this analysis now, and is it going to add up to anything? And the kinds of things that we're interested in, the questions that the social scientists go with, we're not sure if there's anything in the data that's going to allow us to answer them. So that's the most frustrating thing, I would say, at the moment. The other thing is, I think it took us a long time. Maybe we should have done something at the beginning that we didn't, which was, so we're supposed to do these agent-based models. That's part of our project. So we have one of our engineering colleagues he does agent-based modeling. And I think a social scientist, we didn't, I mean, I know what an agent-based model is, but I've never done one. I don't know that literature really well. I don't think I really understood what he needs. So when we did this, we developed scripts for our first round of interviews. And we were almost ready to go out in the field. And then we said, oh, maybe we better let Mike, let's have Mike look at these scripts to see. And it turned out we were missing a lot of the questions that he needed, because for the agent-based model, he was really looking for very small decision points. And we were like asking kind of big, broad questions. So we had to go back and redo the script. Fortunately, we figured it out before we went into the field, but that was a kind of, a learning experience. And I still think, I still have questions about whether the data we collected is really sufficient for the agent-based model. I'm not convinced that it is.
Thank you, Juliet. Maybe just one more question, Eric.
Well, I kind of had two questions. First question was one of the things that's seemed most interesting to me in this was issues of power, and maybe I missed it in your list of things that you studied. I'd be interested if in the first study that you talked about, whether you had investigated the issues of power, and if so, from what theoretical standpoint. The second question, I'm quite interested in something that you didn't talk about really at all, which is sort of non-utilitarian both motives and outcomes in these exchange processes through these platforms. That is are there ways in which sort of Maussian kind of notions infiltrate the motives of the actors, or are part of the benefit package that people derive from participation in these platforms? So those are the two sort of questions that interest me.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so on power, I would say, I guess we didn't use that language, but that whole analysis of dependent versus supplemental earners is really about power, because it basically what we're arguing is, and I went through it so fast, sorry. We're arguing that the platform has power over the dependent workers because of it's a kind of market discipline, and that's how they exert control. But they have much less power over the supplemental earners because they're the ones, because the loss of the job to them is not that consequential. So one quote I remember from a delivery courier, we asked, well, what would happen if your rating fell below a certain amount? They would ask you to go through the orientation again. And so we said, what would happen if that happened? You know, what would you do? And they're like, no way I would do that. So it's like the platform really doesn't have that much control over those people, because they don't need that income. You know, it's really, it's a bonus for them. It's the dependent workers who are the ones who the platform has just, can really exercise more control and power over. And there's also that asymmetric information is important in some of these, like in the ride hail, it is. They have to take jobs, they don't know where they're going and so forth. On your second one, yeah, absolutely. So we did a paper in Socioeconomic Review, and it was the one that I put as moral aspirations of participants. And it was, we didn't include the ride hail and delivery. We wrote this paper earlier on when we had the TaskRabbit and the relay rides and Airbnb, and then our nonprofits. And what was interesting to us, so that's basically arguing many of these people saw this activity as part of a moral project of remaking capitalism.
Okay.
Because they're critical of global capitalism. But
so there's a reflexivity there.
Absolutely. And
okay.
what we argued was, even on the for-profits, they saw themselves as part of creating personalized markets. So, they would say things like, I don't want to give my money to Marriott. These are for the consumers. I'd rather stay in an individual's house and give her the money. Talking about the freedom and autonomy from work that they would get from these things. So, and this is where the nonprofits and the profits they mirrored each other in certain ways. The nonprofit folks were even more anti-capitalist, but this was a moral. So what we argued was, this is really a moral project for people. And what we found was, we argued it was a kind of what we called a domestic imaginary, that their view of the markets they were creating was that they were domestic, like the home. They were recreating the market, creating new markets in the image of a domestic space, which was very highly personalized.
Aristotelian.
Yeah.
Okay. Very cool.
Yeah, less Mosian, I think, because it really, they didn't really use gift language, or but it was really more about personalized interactions, and they set themselves against the cold, impersonal corporate. And so absolutely, much less so on ride hail and delivery. I think these other platforms, you have much more of that. So and I'm pretty sure that's one of the papers where we cite your work. So
it's pretty interesting that there is a range of sort of moral stances that I like this. I like that again, it argues against the sort of putting all of these platform things into one basket. And I like that. That's really cool. Thank you for those.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're really, really different, I think. And that's, kind of, again, like thinking that it's just Uber, I think is really simplistic.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliet, very much for your time and your insights and sharing your reflections. This was a little bit of a gig economy in a certain sense, right? So thank you for the questions, and we really hope to be able to have you over in person and in Access or in some other context pretty soon. So, but enjoy the rest of your day. It's a long one, and see you soon. Just like Eric, and hope to run into you some possible conference or event in a not too distant future. Thank you very much for.
I hope so. Thank you so much. Great questions, and it was really nice to see you all.
Thank you, Juliet. Bye.
Bye.
Shall I?
Okay, no, somebody put something interesting in the chat. Platform papers. I didn't know about this, so I'm gonna go there. Soren, thank you so much. It was really fun.
You're welcome, Juliet. If you want me, I can send the link. You don't need to stick around. I'll just send the link
Okay,
to you.
no, that's fine. I've gotten this thing, but that's great. And
okay.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Take care.
Yes.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Juliet.
Maria Elizabeth.
Thank you.